tribal question. The earliest available writings on tribes are by the British administrators, anthropologists, and military officers. The Britishers never considered the tribes as a threat to their rule, but they were considered as mere law and order problem. Their movement has always been seen with the glass of an insurgency or counterinsurgency. The tribal movements, specifically against the Britishers, had always been termed as the disturbances. The term tribe has often been defined by anthropologists as a colonial construct that the colonial masters who have invented the term scheduled tribe during the census of 1871. They considered the tribes as savage, as noble people with an egalitarian system, with an Arcadian system of society. The colonial attitude towards the tribes have been revealed time and again in the writings of colonial anthropologists. For example, E.G. Mann, W.W. Hunter, William Archer, Dalton, H.H. Risley, and J.H. Hutton. They have written extensively on the tribes, but mostly about their movement and not about their life. One of the most renowned anthropologists was Verrier Elwin, who was exceptionally brilliant in comparison to the other anthropologists of the British period, because he spent half of his life in India, married 2 tribal girls, and he has seen tribal society, their practices, their customs as an insider. So his books, his writings that have existed till day are the most important source material to study the tribal question of today. There is another aspect of the colonial rule or colonial era, and that is the missionaries, who are called the soldiers of the Christ. And there were missionary activities in the tribal areas with the aim of conversion into Christianity. The tribals have a religion which is often defined as animistic, and the Christian missionaries, they often allured the tribes to give up their religion and convert themselves into Christianity. This proselytization process has often been resisted, sometimes accepted by the tribes. There were violent eruptions of the tribal movements against Christianity. At the same time, we have seen that the tribals, for the sake of education, for the sake of health facilities, for the sake of food, they have accepted Christianity. Christian missionaries like L.O. Scripture, like P.O. Bording, and other missionaries who have worked really extensively among the tribes and tried to ameliorate their situation. Coming to the anthropological perspective, as we all know that the discipline of anthropology is an imperial discipline. To study human being has actually derived from the colonial legacy. And there are Indian anthropologists, of course, for example, S.C. Mitra, Charulal Mukherjee, we have Nirmal Kumar Bosu, Surajit Sinha, along with Verrier Elwin and other British anthropologists who also have worked extensively on the tribal situation, their life, and the tribal question. So actually the question is not the tribes, the question is the treatment that with them that has been meted with them. So this is the question, this is the problematic of this topic. So the changing attitude of the state and resistance, we will find that the changing attitude of the state first comes with the colonial acts, and we have almost 5 colonial acts through which we will analyze the changing attitude of the colonial state towards the tribes. Secondly, we will discuss the tribal movements during the colonial period, tribal movements during Gandhian movement, and then we will come to the post-colonial, that is the contemporary Indian situation. Contemporary India has enacted a lot of acts in regard to the tribes and the contemporary tribal movements. So, this is our plan of the study. So, coming to the first issue, that is the colonial acts, and as I have said that there were 5 colonial acts in regard to the tribes. The first act was the Criminal Tribes Act, and it was enacted in the year 1871. It was first implemented in the northern India. In 1876, it was implemented in the Bengal Presidency. In 1911, it was enacted, it was extended to rather in the Madras Presidency, and in 1924, it was amended. What was the basic aim of this Criminal Tribes Act? With this act, the Britishers designated some tribal groups, or rather I would say criminalized certain tribal groups as habitually criminal. For example, the tribes called the Minas or the Bhils or the Shobors of West Bengal, they were termed as criminal tribes, that they are habitually criminal. This criminalization of tribal communities actually played a huge role in enraging these communities to go for a revolt. The second colonial act came with the Santhal Pargana Act. It was called Santhal Pargana's Tenancy Act, which was enacted in 1876 again, and this act was specifically for the tribes because there was a clause that tribal land can be grabbed on the pretext of national interest. And with these acts and the subsequent acts, the Britishers tried to secure their own right on the tribal land because they needed timber for railway construction, and they also needed the non-timber forest producers for other exploitation. On the pretext of the protection of the wildlife, they enacted such acts. Coming to the first Forest Act, which was enacted right after Santhal Pargana Tenancy Act, that is in 1878. The Forest Act also mentioned similar kind of things, for example, that the preservation of forest land, the preservation of land for the wildlife protection. Actually, the main motive behind these Forest Act and also the second Forest Act, which was enacted in 1927, the main motive was to secure land, forest land and non-forest land, for the protection of the Britishers so that they can use the timber for the railway construction. So, it was a complete and out exploitation of the tribal rights of resources and livelihood. The other act was Chotanagpur Tenancy Act, which was enacted in 1908. It again prohibited the tribal people to enjoy their land rights. And because of which there were massive tribal unrest and tribal movement. We have divided the tribal movements during the colonial period into 3 phases. The first phase, of course, starts with the Pahadia movement, and the second phase with Santhal movement, the third phase which is the beginning of the 20th century with Birsa Munda uprising. So, we will take a look what kind of tribal movements were there during the 70s and 1700s and 1800s. So, during the 18th century and 19th century, there were Chuar uprising in Midnapur, there were Paharia rebellion. During 1818 to 1831, there were Bhil uprising in the central part of India, there were Ho and Munda uprising in the Jharkhand, and also Ramoshi uprising, there was Kool uprising in Maharashtra and Gujarat, and Khond rebellion in Odisha. So, Khond rebellion should be mentioned separately because there were a custom among the Khonds in Odisha. It was called Meria. Meria means the small orphans, especially the girls, they were sacrificed in the name of religion. So, it can be comparable to the Sati Pratha of the Hindus, but the Britishers annexed the Khond land on the pretext of free them from these brutal practice of Meria sacrifice. So, it was only a pretext because there was no such hard evidence or hard facts about the Meria sacrifices. So, there were such a lot of excuses or pretexts on which the Britishers invaded tribal land. Coming to the next phase, which is the Santhal rebellion from 1855 to 56, is the most important tribal movement of India, after which the British administration was forced to create a separate Santhal Pargana because there was so much grievances, especially against the moneylenders and the landlords and the dishonest shopkeepers and those people who humiliated the women folk of the tribes, because the tribal people can never stand the humiliation of their women folk. So, these were some of the causes behind the Santhal movement, Santhal uprising, which was called Hul. Hul means rebellion. We have Naikara movement, Khetwar movement of 1870s, we have Bhuinyas uprising, Zhuang uprising, and coming to the end of the 18th century or starting of the 20th century is the Munda uprising with Birsa Munda. It is called Ulghulan. Ulghulan means a huge disturbance, a big disturbance, a movement, and with Birsa Munda tribal movement reached at its peak because, as I said, the most important grievances behind the movement during the colonial period were the exploitation of the landlords and moneylenders and dishonest shopkeepers, and the Britishers who were taking their lands from them, who were snatching away their source of livelihood from them. So, there were Bastar uprising in 1910, which was again very much brutally suppressed by the British military. Coming to the northeastern part, because it is a very much tribal populated or inhabited place. So, there are Ahom revolt in 1828, Khasis revolted, Kukis revolted, and Naga movement. Mainly there were two reasons behind the northeastern tribal movements. One was definitely the imperialism, which was absent in mainland India. In northeastern part, it was basically against the annexation of their land, of tribal land by the Britishers. This was the first reason behind their movement. The second was the inter-ethnic movement, and for example, in Manipur, Kukis revolted against the Zeliangsans, and this inter-ethnic movement could not be suppressed by the Britishers, which became one of the most important reasons behind the tribal movements. And as I said, the ethnic conflict, inter-ethnic conflict, that was the most important reason behind the northeastern tribal movement. With this, we have come to the end of our first segment with a question that who led the Santhal movement. There were four leaders who led the Santhal movement: Sidhu Kanhu, Chand, and Bhoirab. So, tribal movement during the Gandhian era, there were four tribal movements. One was Tana Bhagat movement, the second was Safa Khor movement, the third one was Hari Baba movement, and the fourth one was Gond movement. All these three movements during Gandhian era had some completely different features. For example, these movements were completely non-violent. ahimsa. And secondly, these movements were basically the messianic movement, which means the reorganization of the religion, or we can say that it is a kind of a revivalism, that the tribals, they started reforming their own religion and accepting the Hindu religion, which is Vaishnava religion. Thirdly, it was very much inspired by Gandhi's idealism, Gandhi's principles of vegetarianism, of temperance, Gandhi's charkha and khadi, and also Gandhi's non-violence and severe austerity. All the leaders of the movement, for example, Tana Bhagat was led by Jatra Bhagat, Jitu Bhagat, Hari Baba was Bongama Jidu Kaho, and Rajmohini Devi, who led the Gaunt movement. All this movement was very much influenced and driven by Gandhi's principles, and rumors played a huge role in organizing, consolidating these movements during Gandhian non-cooperation and civil disobedience movement. Coming to the post-independent period, we can analyze very briefly what Nehru said about the tribal, what Nehru's policy was about the tribals. First of all, Nehru had Panchashil, or the 5 principles. Number 1 was the tribals should be developed according to their own genius. Secondly, tribal land, the forest should be preserved for them. Thirdly, we should build up a tribal youth which can work for their own community. Fourthly, there should be a very simple administrative process. So, there should not be any complex system so that the tribals cannot understand what the system is going on, and there should be a very humane character of the policy. But needless to say that when Nehru said that the dams and the temples of modern India, it actually reveals what his attitude was, because after Nehruvian era, everywhere the tribals were being displaced, their lands were being taken away from them, they were being uprooted from their home, hearth and livelihood. So, his Panchashil was only a doctrine, it was never implemented in that way. So, coming to the post-independent contemporary period, which is our main theme, that is, there are a lot of acts that have been made. The first act that came in 2006, which is called the Forest Rights Act, and it started to give the right, the patta of the land to the tribes who till the land, who live in those forest areas, which was grossly violated later on. So, this Forest Rights Act is a huge question mark that how far Forest Rights Act has been succeeded in giving tribal rights to them. The second act that we have with us is the PISA in 1996, which is the Panchayati Raj Extension to the Scheduled Areas Act of 1996. It has specifically mentioned that the Gram Sabha should or definitely be consulted before any kind of step taken in the tribal areas. The Gram Sabha's consent and consultation is of utmost importance as far as the tribal lands are concerned. The third thing that we have already in our constitution is the 5th and 6th scheduled areas. In the 5th scheduled areas, tribal land cannot be sold. In the 5th scheduled areas, there can be no activities of the moneylenders and the landlords. In the 6th schedule, which is the northeastern part, there should be a clear provision that the tribal rights should be protected. And finally, we also have enacted an act which is called Atrocities Against the STs and SCs, which was enacted in 1989, and this act also has vividly mentioned that any kind of atrocities perpetrated against the tribal communities will be punished severely, that perpetrator will be punished severely. So, these are the acts that we have enacted, not the colonial masters, but let us see whether these acts are successful in giving tribals their rights or not. With this, we have come to the end of our second segment with the question that what is the full form of PISA, which is the Panchayat Raj Extension to the Scheduled Areas, which was enacted in 1996. this, we have come to the our third segment, which is the reasons behind the tribal movement of the post-independent period, and there are various reasons. For example, the first is the LPG policy, that is the liberalization, privatization, globalization. With this industrialization, the coming of the multinationals and transnational companies, and the gigantic greed of these multinational companies for the tribal land and profit motive of these companies. Of course, the industrialization, because of which the displacement are taking place on massive scale, disposition are taking place, and the gross violation of the human rights, and also the tribal autonomy movements that started with the demand of the creation of Jharkhand as a separate tribal state, and the assertion of indigeneity, that the right of self-determination, it is also very much visible in the northeastern part of India. So, there are a lot of movements, and I am just discuss this very briefly, starting with Naxalbari in 1967, and Naxalbari was a tribal village, and with the killing of the tribal people, this movement started, and it was extended to Srikakulam in Andhra Pradesh, which is a completely tribal dominated district. And then we will discuss the Kashipur movement of Orissa. You can see UAIL, which is a aluminium company, and this movement caused the killing of the tribals by the independent states police, and the Koil Karo movement of Jharkhand in 2002. Koil and Karo, these two were rivers, and there were a proposal of the construction of a dam on these two rivers, which were hugely protested by the local tribes, and this is the only movement, I would say, which succeeded to stop the project. And also Vedantas has also been stopped by the tribal movements, by the Dongriya Konds of Kalahandi in Orissa. So, Gram Sabha played a very important role in stopping, in installing the project work in Vedanta in Kalahandi. The other movement was Lanjikar movement against Vedanta in 2003. We have Kalinganagar movement against POSCO, that is Pohang Steel Company in Jagatsinghpur. Again, the tribal, they started lying down before the company's construction, and they stopped the construction work successfully in Jagatsinghpur. Very recently, the Lalgarh movement in 2008 and Narayanpatna movement of Orissa, both this movement were supported by the Maoists, by the extremist wing of Marxist party, and these two movements led by the Maoists were quite successful movements, but sometimes these Maoists, they have supported the tribals, but on the other hand, sometimes the tribals have been used by the extremists, and they have been caught between the state sponsored militias like Salvajurum and the Maoists. So, the tribals' predicament is still at risk. And finally, the Pathalgadi movement, which is the most recent movement in Jharkhand, where we have seen that the tribals have erected huge stones, and on which they have written, they have inscribed the constitutional provisions related to the tribals, that the tribal land cannot be grabbed. These kind of messages that they have inscribed on the huge stones. So, this was one of the most important and successful movements of post-independent period, where we have found that Nehruvian doctrine, Gandhian doctrine, all have failed to give the tribals their right, their human rights, their civil rights, their right to livelihood, their right to life. With this, we'll end the lecture, and with a question. A third question, that is, when did the Srikakulam movement take place? And the answer is 1967 to 1970 in the district of Srikakulam in Andhra Pradesh. So, with this we end our lecture. Thank you.